Well, blessings, everybody. This is Dale. Thank you so much for joining with me today on the Word Podcast. We've come to the end of Acts chapter 15, and where we left off, the people in Antioch had just received a letter from the leadership in Jerusalem saying, hey, we're not going to place any more burden on you than that which you're already adhering to, getting away from the cults and the law. And we left off in verse 32 where it said, and Judas and Silas, those were two of the guys that had come from Jerusalem with Paul and Barnabas to testify and witness to the veracity of this letter. Judas and Silas, who were prophets themselves, encouraged and strengthened the brothers with many words. So we see that Judas and Silas were prophets. They were prophets themselves. Now, this tells us something right here if we just pay attention. There were prophets. Okay? They were prophets. And you say, okay, well, what's the big deal with that? There's a huge portion of the body of Christ today who says that there is no such thing in the New Testament church as a prophet. And we've talked about that in various times and things, but they're just little hints here where we see that the gift of prophecy was functioning. Now, I know what people say. They'll say, well, this is during the transitional time of Acts, and after we got the completion of the Bible, there was no need for that, so God doesn't do it anymore. Well, that sounds great. That sounds wonderful, but the Bible does not say that at all, okay? So, verse 33, we press on. They're encouraging, they're strengthening the brothers with many words. And after they had spent some time, they were sent off in peace by the brothers to those who had sent them. So they spend time with them, they listen to them, they're encouraged by their words, Judas and Silas, and then they bless them and they send them on back to Jerusalem from where they came. Verse 35. But Paul and Barnabas remained in Antioch, teaching and preaching the word of the Lord with many others also. Okay, that's really important. With many others also. So Paul and Barnabas remained there from where they had started. Remember, that's where they'd been sent out from originally on this journey when they went to the Gentiles. Then they'd been sent from there down to Jerusalem. They come back and they remain there. They're teaching, they're preaching, but there were many others. It wasn't just the two of them. You know, this sort of tears down that wall and barrier that we have in our mind that there's only one person who does the teaching and the preaching, or there's only a collection of them. There's only certain people do it. There were many others that did it. Verse 36. And after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, so this is Paul speaking, let us return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are. So he's wanting to go back and retrace the journey they'd gone on before and visit all the people who had been saved. Well, this is a great idea. Okay, let's do that. Verse 37. Now Barnabas wanted to take with them John called Mark. Remember John Mark? John called Mark. Remember what happened to him? He went with them on the first journey, but after a while he left and he went back home. Verse 38. But Paul thought best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. Paul did not want to take him. And it says that Paul thought best. Lexham says Paul held the opinion. King James says Paul thought not good to take him. It's literally expressed that way. But Paul thought not good to take him with them. New American Standard, Paul kept insisting that they should not take him along. All four of those translations help us to get some understanding. This was a subject of discussion, of contention, dare I say, of debate, that he didn't want to take him. He thought it wasn't best. Why was it not best? Well, because he had withdrawn from them originally. In other words, he had gone with them and he'd left. Well, okay. And he had not gone with them to the work. In other words, he had not been there in all these churches. He would be new to a lot of them. Well, why would that be a problem? Well, maybe it would be, maybe it wouldn't be, but Paul thought it best that he would not go. Well, what did they do? Verse 39, listen to this. And there arose a sharp disagreement, contention so sharp, King James says, and the contention was so sharp between them. In other words, it was such a sharp disagreement that they separated from each other. They separated from each other. Paul and Barnabas. The Barnabas that had introduced Saul, Paul, to the apostles to start with, to the believers in Jerusalem when nobody wanted to be around him. They were scared to death of him. It's years later, and they have such a sharp disagreement, that they separate. And all this stuff that happened in the 15th chapter of Acts, trying to decide, okay, do you need to become a Jew but to be truly saved? All this stuff. The chapter ends, seriously, with the first church split. Well, one we have an account of, right? They separated. Verse 39 continues. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. Well, what's going on here? They separated and decided to go separate ways. So Barnabas takes John Mark and sailed away to Cyprus. I think that was the direction they went originally. Paul chose Silas and departed, but they went, verse 41 says, and he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. They sort of went the other way. But there's something interesting in verse 40 right here, because people are always talking about, well, who was right, who was wrong? Was Paul right and they shouldn't have taken John Mark? Was Barnabas right and they should have taken him? Barnabas was the son of encouragement. He always wanted to give somebody a second chance, wanted to give him a break. In my mind, it's not so much a right or wrong thing. It's the kind of thing they just had a disagreement over this, and they had different opinions over it. What's really cool is that God used it. Okay, so John Mark goes with Barnabas, Silas goes with Paul, but it's mentioned in verse 40 that Paul and Silas were commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. They were sent out by the brothers by the grace of the Lord in the same way they were sent out before. That's not mentioned about Barnabas and John Mark. But you do not come along and make an argument from silence. You don't sit there and say, well, we don't see this written about them, so they must not have done it to them. Well, you're right. It's not written about them, but we can't jump to the conclusion that they didn't do it. Or we can't jump to the conclusion that they were in error, or they were wrong, or anything like that. Later on, much, much later on, toward the end of his life, Paul writes to, I think he's writing to Timothy when he says this. He says, come visit me quick. Come, I need this, I need this. He was imprisoned. And he says, bring John Mark with you, for he's useful to me for the work of the kingdom. There was reconciliation much later down the road. So verse 41, as I read, Paul and Silas went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Well, what did Barnabas and Mark do? Well, they sailed to Cyprus and they strengthened the churches too. But the first part of Acts focuses on Peter. The second part of Acts focuses on Paul. So you'll see a lot more about Paul as we go along. This passage, I don't want to sound like that. It gives us, what's the word I'm looking for? That we have permission to get in arguments and fights and split churches and things like that because Paul and Barnabas did. No. It's not that at all. But it does show us, does it not? It does show us that such things do happen. So don't walk in fear. Again, I'm Dale. Hey, thank you for your time. I'll see you in the next episode. Goodbye.